Let's look at one of the biggest causes of our first political party system, and that is Alexander Hamilton's economic plan. Remember, one of our maxims of AP US history is that wars are expensive. The Revolutionary War was no exception from this. The American government is left severely in debt from war. The federal government owed $54 million. The state governments owed over $20 million collectively. This is money owed to foreign countries. This is money owed to American citizens in the form of war bonds being sold. Now, eventually, most of these bonds end up in the hand of speculators because it was looking like there was a good chance the government may not be able to pay off those bonds, those loans. So some people bought those bonds at a reduced price with the hope of the government actually paying them off. Other people gave up on getting their bonds actually paid back and sold them to speculators to try to make some of the money that they originally paid back. Remember, wars are expensive, and as a result, Hamilton needed to come up with a plan to pay off our debt from the Revolutionary War for the federal government and for the state governments. Why is debt bad? On a national level, debt is bad because if a country doesn't pay off its bonds, then a country has trouble selling bonds in the future. Remember, when you buy a savings bond or a war bond or a liberty bond, any kind of bond is really a loan to a level of government. And if the federal government doesn't pay back its bonds, people won't buy them in the future. If the government can't sell bonds, it's hard for the government to raise money in the future. And if it's hard for the government to raise money, it might make it hard to fight a war. It would make it hard to undergo building projects that might help the nation. It would make it hard to do things that could help grow the economy. So here is Hamilton's plan. Hamilton's plan is called full funding and assumption. This part of it is. The first part, the full funding, Hamilton proposes that the federal government will repay all debts in full. And this is a big deal because when the revolution was going on in France and they changed government seemingly every 3 months, the new government that came in didn't always promise to pay off the loans and debt of the previous government. Those are different guys. But here, Hamilton is saying the new government under the Constitution will pay off the loans accrued under the Articles of Confederation. He does this because he wants to prove that the new government is financially dependable. He wants the new government to prove that in the future, if you buy a U.S. bond, you can count on getting it paid back. He wants people to see U.S. bonds and, as a whole, the government, as a good investment. This is going to be important because Hamilton and other people involved in the economy, remember Hamilton's Secretary of the Treasury, want American investment to stay in the United States. There's always going to be rich people in America who have money to invest. Now, they could invest in businesses and in governments overseas, but Hamilton and others would prefer that that money stays here in the United States. If they're going to get wealthy with their investments, they might as well help American businesses and the American government in the process. It will make for better economic development in our country. This also gives the wealthy a vested interest in the financial success of the country. We want the new government to be successful. Hamilton gets the wealthy people of America behind this new government under the Constitution because they're going to be the key to them getting the money for the bonds that they hold actually getting paid off. He also, and this is the assumption part, says that the federal government, over there on the right, Washington, D.C., is going to take over or assume all the debt accrued by state governments during the Revolutionary War. State governments had borrowed money to pay their militias. They had borrowed money for other things. The states had over $20 million collectively in debt at the end of the war, separate from the 54 million that the federal government owned. Hamilton recognized that as a nation, we could not be credible. We would not be a dependable borrower of money when some states still owed money. So he's got to make sure all of it gets paid off. The only way to do that is to say the federal government's going to pay that bill. This also further endears investors to the national government. No longer are they loyal to the state government because they are not owed any money by the state government. Their loyalty, anyone who has bonds, shifts to the federal government. They want the federal government to succeed and be powerful and successful and be able to collect taxes so that they can get their bonds paid off. This also, finally, asserts the national economic authority that was already written into the Constitution. It says the federal government shall have the power to regulate commerce, shall have the power to coin money, shall have the power to tax. This just underlines the principle that the federal government, eventually in Washington, D.C., is the supreme national authority. Now, one of the problems with this, one of the objections to this part of Hamilton's plan, is that speculators, that nasty guy in the middle, actually owned almost all the bonds by this point. In fact, some congressmen, I don't know if they looked like that, but some congressmen had bought bonds. And remember, they didn't pay full price for those bonds. The original purchaser, the one who gave the loan to the government during the war, paid full price. And then they waited around under the Articles of Confederation and the economic problems, and they started to think they weren't going to get paid off. So rather than lose their entire investment, let's say they bought war bonds for $20, rather than lose their entire investment, maybe they sold them for half price to a speculator. People like James Madison want the original people paid for their bonds. Now today, when we have electronic and more thorough paper trails of investments, that might be possible. But in this day and age, it's just really who's ever holding the bond is going to get paid. It's unworkable, Madison's proposal to pay the original purchasers. So in the end, some people got really rich off of this part of Hamilton's plan. Some other objections come from states like Virginia, that had not experienced large debt because maybe they hadn't had a lot of fighting taking place on their soil and therefore didn't have to pay their militia nearly as much as, say, a state like Massachusetts. Virginia, which had a relatively small debt, had already paid off their debt. So why should they have to pay higher federal taxes to help pay the taxes for other states? And most of the states that opposed the assumption part of Hamilton's plan were southern states. There is less fighting in the southern states, therefore there are lower or smaller bills for the militia of southern states. In exchange for this, a deal is worked out where two southern states, Maryland and Virginia, will have the new capital of Washington, D.C. sandwiched between them.